This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at numberfire.com, and this is episode 480 of the Late Round Podcast, with many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. Now that the Super Bowl is behind us, it's time to focus more energy on our dynasty rosters. And a key part of that is figuring out who we want to target and who we want to get rid of this offseason. So over the next 2 weeks, the early week late round podcast episodes, they're going to be pretty straightforward. This week, I'll be focusing on a handful of players that I'd be looking to buy this offseason, and then next week, I'll be talking about players that I want to sell. Of course, a lot of these players are going to be team-specific. They need some context. I'll try to provide that context, but how you manage your dynasty roster, it shouldn't necessarily be managed in a black and white way. Some players work better for win-now rosters, some don't. Keep that in mind as you listen to today's show. Now, before getting to players that I'm buying over the next month or two, I wanted to let you know that with the NBA regular season now underway, there's no better place to play daily fantasy than with FanDuel. FanDuel is offering an NBA single-game shootout series contest. Your top 3 scores from 3 separate contests will make you eligible to compete for the $10,000 first place prize. The top 1,600 participants get paid out from the $50,000 prize pool. Contests that are eligible to count towards your score, they'll be labeled with Shootout Series on FanDuel. For more details, visit FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel app today. Eligibility restrictions apply. I don't have any quarterbacks that I'm specifically targeting this offseason, so I'm going to kick things off with running backs. And let's start with a guy that I loved entering the 2020 season, his rookie season, and that's Antonio Gibson. I think it's sometimes important to remember that buying players in Dynasty doesn't always mean that you're buying them low. Buying high is a thing too. Anyone who drafted DK Metcalf last year in startups, they understand this. Just because a player is rising in cost doesn't mean he's off limits to trade for. And I'm intrigued by Antonio Gibson and his future. I also don't mind his DynastyLeagueFootball.com January average draft position, whereas the RB15. Again, that may seem rich, but I do see Gibson having a top 5 ceiling. Let's look at Gibson's journey because I think it helps explain why I see such a high ceiling. He came out of Memphis having played sort of a hybrid role there, but being listed as a wide receiver. In his 2 years there, he ran the ball just 33 times. He had more receptions at 44 than he had rush attempts. My model has a strong focus on receiving for running backs, so the model didn't just ignore Gibson because of his lack of traditional production. So that's a plus. But then the combine happened, and he measured as a super athlete at 228 pounds. And then the draft happened, and he was a day 2 pick. So Gibson, the prospect, wasn't nearly as bad as people might have thought, because he didn't have that traditional production. One of the main reasons he fell in rookie drafts was because Darius Geis was there, and as we know, Geis isn't there anymore. So then we have the regular season. And production-wise, Gibson had what you look for in a rookie running back. One of the things that I've talked about in the past on this show is how we generally have a good idea of how likely a player is going to become a stud based on his first season fantasy total. At wide receiver, we can be a little bit more forgiving. But with running backs, if a running back doesn't show signs of life to start his career, chances are he's not likely to be a top 12 RB1 moving forward. He's likely not going to be a stud. Gibson hit those thresholds. He saw a prorated running back rush share of over 55%, and he carried the ball 170 times. The one thing that we questioned heading into his career, his rushing, that was largely how Washington used him. His target share wasn't terrible at a prorated 8.7%, but we at least know that he can catch the football. That's literally what he did in college. And then he showed explosion running the football. He ranked in the 66th percentile in percentage of rushes that went 10 plus yards among 100 plus attempt running backs, and he was in the 70th percentile when looking at 20 plus yard runs. And keep in mind, this was on a Washington team that ranked 25th in points scored this year. The Washington offense was not good. Now, Antonio Gibson's still way outproduced in the touchdown column. He scored 11 times on the ground when, based on my adjusted touchdowns metric that I work with, that number should have been closer to 6 or 7. But instead of looking at that and saying regression is coming, I think looking at that and saying maybe this is more sustainable with a better offense is more appropriate. Washington should only get better. They should only improve on offense. And if that's the case, Gibson's environment should only improve. So in total, you have a player who didn't even really play running back in college make the leap to the NFL, carrying the ball 170 times as a rookie, showing that he had burst, showing that he could compete with other NFL running backs, and he was fantasy relevant in a bad offense while also not maximizing his ability as a receiver. And we know he has that ability. The sky is the limit for Antonio Gibson. I have him at RB9 in my dynasty rankings, so clearly I'm higher on him than the ADP of RB15. My second buy at running back is a little bit more surprising, I think. I generally don't pay up for veteran running backs because of their lifespan and how they can depreciate in value. But I think there's a case to be made for Joe Mixon being undervalued right now. I know, you've heard this story before. But that's part of the reason he's got a startup ADP of RB19. He's being drafted just before David Montgomery. He's basically at the end of this 20-player tier of running backs, where if you left your draft with one of them as like your RB2 or maybe your RB1 if you went wide receiver heavy, you wouldn't feel bad about it. Because 2 spots below Joe Mixon in DLF ADP is Kareem Hunt, then Ronald Jones, and then Chris Carson. You just get into some ambiguity. I don't think there's much ambiguity with Joe Mixon. We know he's a good running back. Some will say that's not the case, but you don't see the volume that Mixon sees as consistent as he sees it without being good. Over the 3 seasons since Mixon's rookie year, he's averaged at least 17 carries per game each season. His prorated running back rush share, because he only has 1 full season over his last 3, but his prorated running back rush share has been at a minimum 84%. That's crazy. But he's underperformed, sort of, kind of. I really think the only reason we as a fantasy community view him as an underperformer is because he hasn't been able to stay healthy. Mixon averaged, and granted there was a spiked week in there, but he averaged 16.6 PPR points per game this past year before getting hurt. He averaged a little over 14 the year before that and over 17 the year before that. Maybe he's underperformed, but let's not pretend that he's really underperformed. The one thing I want to hit on most, though, is what happened in the passing game with Joe Mixon this past year. Things started off maybe a little bit rough, but in 2 of his 6 games played, he hit a 17+% target share. His 2020 season showed him with a prorated target share of 12.3%. And it just so happened to occur when the Bengals got a new young quarterback in Joe Burrow. Now moving forward, Mixon's got the quarterback, and the Bengals should hopefully improve their offensive line this offseason. If they keep using him as they did last year, where he was pacing towards his usual reliable rush share combined with a high target share, then he should be absolutely fine. There's a possibility he's going to end up being a big value in redraft leagues. And remember, Mixon is still only 24 years old. He'll be 25 at the end of July. He's got time, and he's got that second contract too. To me, Mixon just seems to be priced with some recency bias embedded in that price. But with that bump in target share last season, I'm expecting a big 2021 if he's healthy. I admittedly wasn't all in on Chase Claypool as a prospect. I had some worries about how he would separate at the next level, but clearly the athleticism that he showed off had transferred. Chase Claypool's a freak. And the vibes I get from Claypool sort of remind me in a way of how we felt about DK Metcalf after his rookie year. The difference is obviously that Metcalf has a much more stable situation at quarterback, which feeds into his overall dynasty value, which is the wide receiver 1 in dynasty. But Claypool's coming off an insane rookie season. He scored 11 times in total, 9 through the air, 2 on the ground. And when you look up rookie wide receivers since the late 90s who scored at least 10 touchdowns during that rookie campaign, here's your list. Randy Moss, Mike Williams, Mike Evans, Odell Beckham, Tyreek Hill, Calvin Ridley. That's a pretty good list. During Claypool's rookie year, he didn't play full-time starter snaps. But according to Pro Football Focus, among relevant wide receivers, Claypool was 25th in yards per route run. That's one of the better predictive metrics that we have at wide receiver. I do think there's downside with Claypool when we look at his overall situation. An offensive line that needs rebuilt, a quarterback that needs upgraded. But at wide receiver, we've got to be more concerned about the talent itself than the immediate situation. Though the immediate situation should still matter. And that immediate situation should still get better on the volume front anyway, because Juju Smith-Schuster is likely going to be gone next year. Yes, maintaining that touchdown pace is going to be tough, but it's good to see a rookie do what Claypool did this past year. And it was also good to see the Steelers manufacture touches for him, especially close to the end zone. Honestly, Claypool just might be special. I want him on my dynasty rosters, even if that means that I'm paying a low-end wide receiver 2 price tag. It's easy to see a path to him improving on that rank after this season. Like I said at the top, you have to make moves that are dependent on your team. Like if you go for Joe Mixon, you should be more of a competitive team versus a rebuild team. And then really anyone could just go after Chase Claypool. This next player is someone that I think only a competitive team should go after, and it's Jarvis Landry. This is the boring, unsexy player on today's list. Trading for Jarvis Landry is like leaving the bar 3 hours earlier than your friends to avoid a hangover. It's like buying a Honda. It's not necessarily the most enjoyable thing in the world, but it's safe. It's a safe investment, and it's often smart. Landry's currently the wide receiver 46 in startups, despite the fact that he's 28 years old, and he's yet to catch fewer than 72 passes in a single season. Now look, I understand his 2020 season was the first season where he didn't hit 80 receptions, and he only scored 3 times. But that's sort of the point. You're buying low with Jarvis Landry. The thing is, Landry entered the year with this hip injury. He was on the injury report for that hip until late October. Up until that point, he was averaging just 10.2 points per game. Past that point, that number jumped to 14. And as the season went on and the Browns didn't play in crappy weather, he just got better and better. Yeah, his target share got a slight bump with the OBJ injury, but Landry averaged 19 fantasy points per game over his last 5 as touchdown regression really started to hit for him. The downside with Landry is that Cleveland's going to be a fairly run-heavy team. That means he's going to have to maintain a 20 to 25% target share to get enough of a boost in overall volume. But I don't see why he can't or why he wouldn't. The fact that he got better as the year went on is a good sign that he'll be able to get back to form next season. Because like I said, it's not like he's necessarily old. He's not going to be a league-winning wide receiver type. He's a value type. Landry's one of those guys who's great on deeper starting lineup rosters. And you shouldn't have to give up that much to get him. So last year I did that episode on bailing on unproductive rookies. The gist of it is that if a rookie underperforms and does absolutely nothing or very, very little during his rookie season, you should probably get rid of him in Dynasty if his value is still relatively high. It really was what led me to selling N'Keal Harry last offseason after being on N'Keal Harry as a rookie. That doesn't bode very well for Bryan Edwards. He finished 2020 with 15 targets, 11 catches, and fewer than 200 receiving yards. The difference is that Bryan Edwards is the wide receiver 57 in startups right now. So getting him is not going to be that difficult. Harry was still relatively pricey last season at the same time at wide receiver 29. The reason I'm buying Edwards is because one of the main ways that truly unproductive wide receivers then went on to have decent fantasy careers, one of the main ways they did that was because they were injured as rookies. And Edwards has that. So there's at least some excuse for his mediocre play. But he was also a really good prospect. He ranked in the 86th percentile in my prospect model, and anything above the 80th percentile is usually pretty good. He had an above average stat score, and his breakout age was under 18 years old. Now, do I think he's got a high probability of hitting after what we saw during his rookie year? Of course not. I don't think anyone should think that. But because he's priced where he's priced, I'm not against a bench asset trade for Edwards since the prospect profile is definitely there. And there's still not a whole lot of alternatives in that Raiders offense either. Another wide receiver I liked from the great 2020 class is Tyler Johnson. He had one of the best stat scores, which is basically the production metrics that I look at put together in the model, but he had one of the best stat scores that my wide receiver model has ever seen. He was a freak production-wise in college. He unfortunately just fell in the draft and he was a day 3 pick to the Buccaneers. So he wasn't that much of a priority as a result. Because not only was the draft capital not there, but he all of a sudden was competing for looks on a team with very good wide receivers. We don't really have a large enough sample to work off of from Johnson's 16 target rookie season, but I thought he looked pretty good by the eye test. The problem for Johnson is likely going to be immediate opportunity, and in order for that opportunity to hit, he likely needs Chris Godwin to leave. Godwin played 67% of his snaps from the slot this year, which is where Johnson lined up 42% of the time. Johnson played the 4th most snaps from the slot on the Buccaneers this year, but he had a higher rate of slot snaps than both Mike Evans and Scotty Miller. The thing is, though, Chris Godwin's a free agent. I do expect Tampa to re-sign Godwin, but there's always a chance that does not happen. And if it doesn't happen, it could elevate Tyler Johnson. Even if Godwin does re-sign with the Bucs, Tyler Johnson's going to have a chance to grow into a 3rd wide receiver role for the Bucs. And if he does that, then he's one injury away from being a decent starter. Considering he's the wide receiver 78 in startups, I don't mind him as a very cheap target. You guys remember Courtland Sutton? He didn't play a whole lot this year because of a torn ACL, and that injury has really pushed him down draft boards. Last year at this time, Sutton was the wide receiver 15 in startups. Now he's the wide receiver 26, and I'm buying. Now, I know why his ADP dropped. Not only did he get hurt, but the Broncos drafted a ton of talent at pass catcher during last year's NFL draft. Now it might be more difficult for Sutton to capture a massive target share in that offense. And the quarterback situation is really iffy too. Sutton is a game changer though. He dominated 2019 under really bad circumstances. He finished the year with a 26% target share. He also finished 4th in yards per team pass attempt, which is predictive not just at the college level, but the pro level as well. He finished behind only Michael Thomas, Stephon Diggs, and A.J. Brown. I said this when Jerry Jeudy was drafted, and I'll reiterate that same thought. The relationship between Sutton and Jeudy is not one where you've got two true alphas going up against one another. It's more of a Julio Jones, Calvin Ridley deal. Judy's a great complement to Sutton's size and physicality. And like I talked about on last week's mailbag show, good players see good target shares. Sure, Sutton may have a hard time reaching a 32 or a 33% target share because there's decent competition within that receiving group. But he's a very good receiver. He's an alpha wide receiver. He's going to command a target share in that 23, 24, 25% range year in and year out. Now, to be honest, my rankings aren't that far off from where Sutton's being drafted right now. But I've seen polls on Twitter and people just not being very excited about Courtland Sutton. And that's why I think that we're at a point where you should just throw something at the Courtland Sutton manager and see if you can get him cheap. It's really easy to forget how good players are when they suffer season-ending injuries. And Sutton, if you remember, he was pretty dominant given his situation a couple of seasons ago. The last player I'm going to talk about on today's show, it was going to be Harrison Bryant. So there's a freebie for you. But I'm going to pivot that and I'm going to go with Gerald Everett. Everett currently has an ADP of tight end 26. And that's behind guys like O.J. Howard, Rob Gronkowski, the aforementioned Harrison Bryant, Eric Ebron. There are lots and lots of tight ends ahead of him with question marks. Now he's got question marks of his own too. Like where he's even going to play next year. Everett's a free agent. And quite simply, I'd love to throw a dart at a tight end with his measurables. I did a study this past offseason on finding breakout tight ends. And one of the things that study showed was that athleticism matters for fantasy tight ends a lot more than at wide receiver and running back. The vast majority of breakout tight ends were incredibly athletic. And looking at playerprofiler.com, Everett had a 74th percentile speed score, an 88th percentile 40 time, and he was at least in the 81st percentile in both burst and agility score. He's still 26 years old. He's going to be 27 next season. So why not throw that kind of dart? Why not cross your fingers and hope that he can find a team where he'd maybe walk into more volume? We know tight end is flat outside the top handful of guys. So buying these types of players, athletes who may see a change of scenery and who have really low ADPs, I think that makes a lot of sense. So I'm buying Gerald Everett. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. I'll talk to you later in the week with the Weekly Mailbag Show.